right, good afternoon. Thank you all for staying with us all day. This is our last panel of the day. My name is Aimee Meacham, and I am with NTIA. And on behalf of NTIA, we just want to thank you all for being here today. So with that, I'm going to get to the panel. This is our federal funding panel, and I am pleased to be joined by an esteemed group of federal colleagues who have an amazing amount of federal, local, county government experience, nonprofit, private sector, and they have all been dedicated to federal service for the last few years. So first I have Keith Adams, and I'm going to just refer to my notes for titles, but he's the Assistant Administrator for Telecommunications at the Rural Utility Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And Keith is responsible for a portfolio of about $1 billion annually, and he has a $4 billion loan portfolio that he's responsible for as well. And he's going to go into all the federal funding that our U.S. offers. I have Lora Routt, who is from the Housing and Urban Development Administration, and Lora is the Senior Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grants Program. Lora specifically works on the community block development grants and quite a number of other programs, and she has great local and county government experience as well. So she has been in some of your shoes. I have Carol Mattey who is the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Wireline Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. And Carol actually used to work at the NTIA as well, so we are pleased to have her here. And she's our universal service guru. She works on everything universal service and had a lot of hand in changing the high cost fund and setting up the Connect America Fund. And finally, I have Karen Hanson, who is my colleague at NTIA and is the Director for Partnerships and Interagency Affairs. And Karen has really spearheaded our work on the Broadband Opportunity Council along with Keith to make sure that we are working collectively as a federal government with other agencies to see what barriers, as Larry noted earlier, what barriers we can really reduce in the federal government and what additional funding might be made available for broadband. So with that, I'm going to let each of the panelists give you an overview of really what their programs cover and what types of funding they have available so that you know that, and then we can get into some questions. So Keith? Okay,
good afternoon. I am pleased, thank you Aimee, for including me in this panel. I'm honored to be here. I'm here with a few USDA colleagues, so I want to make sure I introduce Joe Bradley and Steve Cornier. And I don't know if the State Director, our Rural Development State Director, Mario, there's Mario right there, Mario Villanueva is here. So we thank you, and Mario, if you have your staff here, we thank everybody for coming. We in the Rural Utility Service are part of the Rural Development Program area, and we're responsible really for making sure that we're providing opportunities to change people's lives by economic growth and by providing infrastructure specifically in the Rural Utility Service. We have electric loans, water and waste loans, and we're responsible for telecommunication loans and grants. We have, as Aimee mentioned, about $1 billion in loans and grants, and we have 2 major loan programs and 2 major grant programs. The first loan program is our telecom infrastructure program. That's our traditional program. We have about $690 million available in that program this fiscal year. And this year we have our Farm Bill Broadband program, which we have carryover from the last 2 years because of some regulations that we had to have approved. So we have about $55 million in that program this year. We're currently evaluating applications in that program. With our traditional program so far this year, we've approved 12 loans for about $200 million, and we have 9 more loans that we're processing. And then we have 2 smaller grant programs, Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program, which provides equipment for universities, educational institutions, hospitals, and other institutions that need specific equipment. That program is about $19 million. And we have a Community Connect grant program, which is for areas that are really considered to have no internet service at all. And that's about $11 million. The distance learning and telemedicine notice of solicitation of applications just ended on March the 14th. So we're now in the process of tallying up how many applications we have and going through the approval process there. Our Community Connect grant program solicitation of applications should happen sometime towards the end of this month, maybe into the middle of April. So those are our main grant programs, so I'll stop there.
So can I ask you a couple questions?
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about who is actually eligible for some of these programs?
Well, the two grant programs, anybody that is serving a rural area is eligible for our distance learning and telemedicine program. So that's probably the only program we have where large universities or large hospitals, large entities can apply for our services. But it has to be in an area that fits the definition of rural. With Community Connect, you can draw your service map, but it has to be in areas that have no service. I think it's 3 megabytes up and 1 down. For our traditional program, it's for communities of 5,000 or less. And for our Farm Bill broadband program, it's for communities 20,000 or less.
And just one more, you mentioned areas that are defined as rural. Can you tell us what that means for the RUS? I know it probably depends.
Yeah, that has a different definitions of rural, but for us, it's going to be communities of 5,000 or less.
Okay, perfect.
And for the Farm Bill program, 20,000 or less.
Okay, great. Okay, Lora?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation for coming here. And typically when people hear about the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, you think about Section 8. But we have a new secretary. He's been there almost 2 years, and his interest has been broadband access and increasing it to low-income families. And with this being a big emphasis of President Obama, he's taken charge and coming in and wanting to do so many things with our funds and making sure that we're increasing access to low and moderate income families. He being of a modest background, he knows the importance of having the adequate resources and being able to succeed, and of course he's super ambitious and he went to Stanford undergrad and Harvard Law, he and his twin brother. But nonetheless, he is committed to making sure that our department is doing the best that we can. Recently, we put out frequently asked questions on 2 grant programs that are already in many communities across the country. We have a community development block grant program, which is a formula grant and is given to cities, urban counties, that's those over 50,000, and states. And with those funds, you can use the funds if the community has come into agreement that this is what they want to spend their funds on doing, being able to wire a facility, a public facility, or laying the facilities, the lines within underground, or being able to provide computers or literacy, digital literacy to low-income families. So basically, anyone any family that's 80% or less of the area median income would be eligible to take part in this program. But the funds go to the cities. They're the ones that decide if this is what they want to do, and I'll talk about that a little bit as to how that process works and being able to provide it, and many are already doing that. But we just put out a frequently asked question to remind people that it has to meet a national objective, of which one is to benefit low to moderate income persons, either individually or area-wide, and being able to not only do it with those funds, but also with our affordable housing grant program, which is called Home Investment Partnership. And you can also use those funds to wire place multifamily or single-family housing and during your construction or maybe even rehab. So we have those questions already out there. People are aware. We've let our 2,000 or plus more grantees know that these are eligible expenses. The other thing that we're trying to do to enhance those programs' ability to outreach or enhance the access to broadband, we're considering rulemaking. And two things that we're going to be requiring is for any project that is a new construction project or a substantial rehabilitation project, that they will have to make it wired for internet. And it's probably going to be for multifamily because we're trying to get the biggest bang for our buck. And so that would mean being able to buy the equipment or being able to have a computer room, wiring it, because the one thing that our secretary says is just not acceptable, that now that so many schools are requiring students to have to access the internet to even do research papers, homework, and the like, you can't do it on a handheld. And he wants to make sure that, at least in the housing that HUD assists, that they would have a computer room to be able to do their homework. It's not good enough to be able to have to go to the library. 9 times out of 10, the computers are broken down, or they are unavailable because other people are using it and not having them to go outside of their home to do their homework. So we're going through the rulemaking process on that. The other part is what is known as our consolidated planning process. This is the framework that we have for all of our communities to do their community development and housing development planning. It's a 3 to 5 year plan, and they have to identify what are the priorities within the community. So they meet with all the stakeholders. We have these funds available. How do you want to spend them? And this is a good opportunity for anybody that wants to meet with your local community development department and saying, hey, we want to be able to partner with this nonprofit or this company and being able to increase the broadband. So what we're going to be asking our communities to do when they're doing their community planning is to do an assessment on what their broadband needs are. Where are the areas within your low-income areas that need access to broadband? And what are you going to do about it? And come up with a plan. Now, we at HUD cannot force them to do it. It is a local-driven process. We will strongly encourage them to do it. So those are the two things that we're doing to make sure that that this is more accessible to the low-income families in the nation. So those, like I said, those are what we're doing now. The other thing that we have in place, which there's really not any money attached to it, is our Connect Home program. And it has gone into effect. We have 28 communities, including Seattle, that is participating. And HUD's public housing authorities are working with local providers and being able to provide the broadband access and being able to have partnerships to make their services more affordable, maybe even reduced significantly or free, ideally. And we do have some partnerships already being established with broadband assistance. We have with Cox Communications, Google, Sprint, or some of them in Cherokee Communications. And then we also have some digital literacy education and skills training, because not only do we want to have our students to be able to have internet access, we want to have their parents who are typically underemployed or unemployed. And as we know, being able to look for a job, you have to have internet access because everybody's application process is now online. So a lot of times they're not able to have that equipment at their home, or even have the access nearby to be able to get on and look for a job. And it also gives them an opportunity to get some skills on the training on the internet. And some of the partners we had so far, abcmouse.com, the American Library Association, Boys and Girls Club, Best Buy, and a few others. So these communities have already, we picked those through a competition process. They already had a pretty good foundation anyway, and then just being able to do that is to be able to hit the ground and running. And so far, it's going quite well. Seattle's doing very well. So the implementation plans are in, and the end of the process for this round ends in June, and hopefully we'll have some readouts on the levels of success. So our department is doing quite a bit, not only just being able to provide the funds, but even having pilot projects to seeing how we can specifically address the needs of those that are in the lower income brackets.
Did I see on one of your Connect Home releases that CenturyLink is also a partner?
Yes.
Okay, since we're in CenturyLink country, I just wanted to make that clear.
I want to make sure we acknowledge that.
And I did want to ask a quick question. So when you talked about the community level needs assessment, do you have a sense of what that entails? So for folks that are taking this information back to their own communities?
Sure. It's called, again, the consolidated planning process, and I've done it not just, on the level of the national level where I'm just like, yeah, I'm espousing this, but I actually had to do it. So it takes about 18 months of planning to actually get to that actual document. And what the grantee is required to do is to let everybody, the nonprofits, the universities, the school districts, the homeless service providers, any and everybody that has a stake holding interest in our programs, we notify them saying, okay, we're going out, we're coming up with our next 3 to 5 year plan, we want you to come and participate. So we usually have a big kickoff, everybody comes, you break off and you're talking about housing, homeless service providers, public services, then it gets more specific to being able to serve veterans or the youth, education, public safety, economic development, community development. So it's several areas that we have to touch upon to be able to get a good assessment of the needs of the community. So we meet several times. We come up with a list of priorities that everybody wants for the city to consider. And you go through a couple of public hearing processes in addition to all these other meetings that are going along. And they will let you know, okay, we've taken all of your considerations. These are what we're going to have as low priority, medium priority, or high priority. And given that our funds have been reduced over time, most communities can only address what's only in a high priority. But they cannot, at this time, or any time, be able to fund any project that is not already indicated as a need in the consolidated planning process. So even if we were to, give them money right now, is that a demonstrated need in your community, yes or no? If it's no, then you need to go out to the public and seek comment. So it's like I said, it's usually about an 18-month process for like a larger jurisdiction like where I was, maybe up to a year, but it does take some time. We do want to get as much input from everybody, and they also take comments throughout the year so they can, when they have to do an allocation of their annual funds, which is called the annual action plan, then they can keep in mind, okay, these are the kind of projects that we need to fund, and making sure that everybody's input is in that as well, because that's another public hearing process. So we try and get out to as many people. If you're not already have a relationship with your local community development department, I urge you to reach out and letting them ask when is your consolidated planning process or your annual action plan process, and being able to introduce yourself and letting them know what you can do.
Great, thank you. Carol?
Like everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. I've noticed sitting up on this part of the stage, you have just a beautiful view of this lovely scenery. In any event, I've been working on Universal Service Fund issues since 2000. I directly am responsible for overseeing the Connect America Fund, and in the past I've also overseen the efforts to modernize the E-rate program and the rural health care program. The Universal Service Fund is a program that really embodies a statutory commitment. It's been in place for many decades. Today, the Universal Service Fund, the Federal Universal Service Fund, distributes over close to $9 billion a year. The programs are administered by an independent administrator known as the Universal Service Administrative Company, which operates under direction from the FCC. And I'm going to focus on the 3 programs that today expressly support broadband. The 4th program is the Lifeline program, and several people have already mentioned how the Commission will be considering a plan to expand that program to broadband later this month. So first, let's start with the Connect America Fund. For several decades, the Universal Service Fund has supported telephone service, and I mean voice telephone service provided by the incumbent telephone companies in rural and high-cost areas. The program also, in recent years, has supported mobile wireless providers and, in some instances, competitive wireline carriers. In 2011, the FCC reformed that program and created the Connect America Fund, and it set out an overall framework, and we've been working to implement that framework ever since. Of that, it's a $4.5 billion annual budget, and the Commission decided that $1.8 billion in annual funding would be provided to support service in the areas that are served by the larger telephone companies, and that would be companies like CenturyLink and Frontier. And then $2 billion was set aside for the areas that are served by the smaller telephone companies. $500 million was set aside for wireless mobile services, and at least $100 million annually for service in remote areas. So last year, we implemented what we call Phase 2 of the Connect America Fund, and that basically entailed an offer of support to the large telephone companies, and they could accept that offer or decline the offer. And if they accepted the offer, then they are obligated to expand broadband to a defined number of locations in every state. Now, in the 3 states that are part of the Pacific Northwest, the incumbents all accepted the offer. So what that means is they're subject, and you've heard about this in the prior discussion, they have a 6-year period in which they have to build out service. The 6-year term runs from 2015 through 2020. In the first year, obviously, folks were focused on the planning aspects of it, and then they'll be subject to interim deployment milestones. They'll be reporting annually to the FCC on where they've spent the money and which locations now have service. And then they're subject to specific enforceable penalties if they don't actually meet those commitments. In the areas, and I realize it's not relevant to this part of the country, but in the areas where the incumbent turned down the funding, the Commission decided that then the funding would be provided through a competitive process. And as part of that competitive process, the Commission decided a couple years ago it would include in that competitive bidding process the extremely expensive areas to serve, which were not part of that offer of support to the price cap carriers. And we call those areas the remote areas, and that is relevant to this tri-state region, because in that competitive bidding process, entities will be able to bid on the right to receive support to serve extremely high-cost areas. Now, in order to receive funding in this program, the recipient has to be what we call an eligible telecommunications carrier. And to be an eligible telecommunications carrier, or the acronym is ETC, you have to be designated either by the State Public Utility Commission, or if the state lacks jurisdiction over that kind of provider, designated by the FCC. So this is a program that is specifically focused on service providers. Now, as I said, the larger companies are, going to be working in the years ahead to be building that out. Now, there also, as I said, the program provides support to the smaller telephone companies. The FCC is currently considering an order that will undertake a number of reforms for those smaller incumbent providers as well. And the FCC is considering how to structure that competitive bidding process. So just from listening to the questions from most of this room, I realize most of you are not incumbent telephone providers, so you're probably wondering, so how do we get access to that money? And I think the most important thing is to work with service providers and consider whether you yourself could go through that process to become designated as an eligible telecommunications provider, because as I said, in the competitive bidding, if you're willing to become certificated and become an eligible telecommunications carrier, you would have access to the money. But if you are not that kind of an entity, if you're a community or some other kind of entity, then it really is important to be working with existing entities in the area and help make the business case so that those areas can bid on support to build out service in the areas that don't have it today. Now, the second program I'm going to talk about is the E-rate program. And again, you've heard various people previously today talking about that. It's different. It's a program that specifically focuses on subsidizing the cost of service to schools and libraries. So schools and libraries actually apply for funding, and they apply every year. They have to go through a competitive bidding process to select their service provider. The service providers are not required to be eligible telecommunications carriers. It can be any kind of a service provider. The FCC in 2014 did 2 rulemaking proceedings to update and modernize the E-rate program. In the first order, the FCC created specific goals, goals for what we wanted to achieve to increase connectivity for schools and libraries, and it focused on how to increase connectivity within schools and within libraries. In the second order, the Commission focused on expanding access to funding. It raised the funding cap for the program. The funding cap had been $2.4 billion annually, and it raised that funding cap to $3.9 billion. And it also adopted a series of rules that would expand opportunities to get funding to build out fiber, to actually connect the schools and connect the libraries. And we've been busy at work, in the last year to put the mechanical aspects of getting those rules underway, and we're looking forward to that, in the years ahead. Now, the last program, the Rural Healthcare Program, again, that program was reformed in 2012 to create what we call the Healthcare Connect Fund. There was a pre-existing program called the Telecommunications Program, which since the late 90s has been subsidizing the cost of telecommunications service for eligible rural healthcare providers. The new Healthcare Connect Fund provides funding for consortia, and consortia can be comprised of both urban and rural healthcare facilities as long as a majority of the members of the consortia are rural. And the FCC did that building on a prior pilot program that had been put in place in 2006, which provided funding for consortia. The pilot program is still in place with some funding commitments still being dispersed, but there are no new applicants for that pilot program, so I'm not going to focus on that. Overall, the healthcare program in the last funding year provided about $200 million or so. About half of that was for the telecom program. About $100 million of that was for the new Healthcare Connect Fund. That program is the only one of the programs that I've talked about that is, for better or worse, underutilized. It has a $400 million funding cap, so there's room to grow there. And so the FCC is obviously, it just implemented that Healthcare Connect program fully, starting on January 1st of 2014. So again, there's room to grow with more opportunities. And like the E-rate program, it is a yearly application process. The entities that apply for the funding are the healthcare facilities. Like the E-rate program, they have to go through a competitive bidding process for service providers. And then they put in the application, and then they get a funding commitment, and then that funding then defrays the cost of the service that they're purchasing from the service provider. So with that whirlwind overview, I'll stop and take questions or pass it along.
So just a quick question about the rural health care program. What is the FCC's definition of rural?
Oh gosh, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Well, my only point is I think that the government doesn't make it easy by having some sort of universal definition.
I know that there are probably more. I know for a fact that there's more than 20 definitions of rural in federal funding programs
like small
across
business.
the federal government. And forgive me, I do not remember the specific one for the rural healthcare program. I could have answered what it is for the rural telecommunications carrier and the high cost program, but anyway, we won't go there. The point is, I mean, even within the universal service funding programs themselves, we have different definitions for one program versus another, and it's very arcane.
And so that's just something to be aware of when you're looking at all these programs. So something else that I think people get curious about when you talk about some of the universal service funds and the ability to build fiber to schools or have fiber builds in different parts of the program, are there rules with respect to dark fiber in that program, and are there ways that communities can use that to provide connections to carriers outside of the program?
The simple answer is the connections that are funded by the E-rate program only can be connections to schools and libraries. If a community wants to put together a broader project, then the cost of serving the non-schools and non-libraries have to be cost allocated out of the funding request. So the funding only will be provided through the program for the specific portion of the connection. So for instance, if you're going to put together a project, and I'm just making up numbers, you've got 600 strands of fiber and only 20 of them are going to schools and libraries, then it would be cost allocated so that the program is only going to be providing funding for the 20 strands of fiber and not the other fiber for other aspects of the communities. And that's one of the things we hear about a lot, because obviously communities are interested in serving all of the anchors, not just a subset of anchors, and we're subject to sort of our overall statutory constraints, because under the federal law, the E-rate program only can provide support to schools and libraries.
Thank you, Carol. So Karen's here to talk about some of the other opportunities that are available across the federal government. And maybe you want to start with a little bit of background on the Broadband Opportunity Council and what happened there, and then go into some of the opportunities that came out of that.
Sure, thank you so much. So as you've heard a couple of times today, last year President Obama signed a presidential memorandum which created the Broadband Opportunity Council. And HUD and USDA were some of our members on the council. The FCC was also involved, which was a really interesting and intense process of working with these 25 different federal agencies to see where within their existing programs and regulations and policies they could make changes that would allow greater flexibility to support broadband deployment and adoption. And I think the real big win was in recognizing across the board, all 25 agencies, that broadband is no longer just in the purview of an infrastructure play. It really does impact healthcare delivery, it impacts education, it impacts workforce development. So while there was not new funding, and the caveat was that we were told to just look within the scope of existing programs, the agencies did do a really deep dive into how they could create more flexibility within their programs. So, and I would also say the process also involved stakeholder input. So we did a request for comment process. We got a lot of great insights from tribal communities, from schools, from libraries, from industry, from city governments, county governments. So there was a real range of recommendations that came in the door to us. And all the agencies took a look at all of the recommendations that were specific to their programs to really see what they could do. And the result was this report, which is available on the web. You can find it at NTIA's website or the White House, which details, as Larry mentioned today, and also as David Edelman mentioned, the 36 discrete actions that federal agencies committed to taking. And yet there was also more. There was a commitment that the agencies made to continue to looking for ways to support more broadband deployment and adoption. And represented here between USDA and HUD are some of the largest programs that made changes. So I think it was really remarkable to see what HUD did, and I really want to congratulate HUD and you and all the work that you're doing, because it really is a significant pot of new money that, or not new money, but money that was given the flexibility or the designation that these funds could now support broadband. But there were some others that I think I'm kind of wearing my Broadband Opportunity Council hat to tell you about, because those agencies aren't here today. But one of them was Treasury. The Treasury Department was represented on the Broadband Opportunity Council, and they took a look at the new markets tax credit. And so if you go and look for the November 2015 update to the new markets tax credit guidelines, it specifies that broadband infrastructure and related expenses are now eligible. So you'd have to go through, there would have to be a community development entity that decides to apply for that tax credit, but it could be used for broadband deployment in communities that are low to moderate income. So that's one new option which was created. A couple of other areas, DOJ, through their Justice Assistance Grants programs, they're going to be issuing guidance specifying that broadband is also now an eligible expense. DOL is also going to be issuing guidance saying that you can use funds that are designated for the one-stop centers, that those funds can be used for broadband connectivity purposes. And there's a whole range of other actions specific to funding that were made and outlined in that report. And agencies are continuing to look for opportunities to grant more flexibility to communities. I think the other thing that was done through the process was to find ways that communities could become more informed about their options and about how to create those more compelling business cases, and how to, as Lora mentioned, how to describe the state of their broadband connectivity in their communities. So one of the things that NTIA actually committed to was the development of a community connectivity initiative, which you've heard a little bit about today, and we have a workshop tomorrow to go into it in more detail. But one of the benefits of that is going to be giving communities that ability to look across their situation of connectivity and be able to make the case either to a provider or, in the case of HUD, for example, one of the things that we're looking at doing with HUD is making sure that the criteria that goes into that connectivity initiative will also be able to check the box for fulfilling the requirements of the consolidated planning process that Lora mentioned. So those are just a couple of the areas that we touched on. I can talk a little bit more about some of the other changes, policy changes that support broadband deployment, but I'll let you get to some more questions.
So why don't you do that after you just make sure, I mean, I think we have a pretty sophisticated audience, but in DC, and we're all used to this, that we tend to speak in acronyms that are specific to our agency. And so I just want to make sure that DOJ is the Department of Justice, DOL is the Department of Labor, and I think I didn't catch anyone else doing that. So I do it all the time, and so I just want to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. So if you want to talk a little bit about the rest of the process, that would be great. Thanks.
So in addition to making funding clarifications, some of the other actions that the agencies are taking are still in progress. And I would say that if you look at the report, you'll notice that each of the action items has milestones that we are tracking. And I will share a story from the process that I hope Larry won't mind me sharing. As soon as the report was cleared, he sent a note around to some of us saying, "Congratulations, team, now you have to execute." So that's always been top of mind, that this is just a report, but actually the hard work of getting all of the actions done is currently underway and is still going to be underway. But one of the areas that I think is a recent win, and we heard about this initially from industry, who told us that in some of the EPA programs, the water sewer programs, some local governments, while the trenches were open for those being funded by EPA, they were being told that they could not at the same time lay down conduit. So that came to our attention. We were able to elevate it within EPA. They were able to determine that that was essentially an urban myth. And so they issued clarifying guidance to all of their regions saying that, in fact, there is no prohibition within EPA guidelines that will prohibit a local government from laying down conduit at the same time, as long as it doesn't interfere with other timelines that the governments may have had to agree to for those kinds of repairs. So that's one example of a dig once policy and frankly a success story of making the agency aware that there was this barrier, because it was a perception, it was in effect a true barrier. And so they were able to issue this clarifying guidance, and we expect that won't continue to be a problem, but obviously if it is a problem, then we'll need to do a better job of getting the word out. But that's one example of a dig once policy that was issued that is going to, we hope, remove some of the barriers that were perceived out there. Another quick one, DOT and the Department of Interior are working very hard to try to come to an agreement on how to streamline the process of permitting on federal highways that also cross over federal lands. So that is underway. It's not as simple as you might expect, but they're working very hard at trying to find a solution to that problem, which will largely affect a lot of lands out in the West, as you can probably imagine. So those are just a couple of other examples.
And then just to put a plug in for Karen and her team, if you're working with a federal funding stream and there's something that you have a question about, or you think that something should either be an eligible cost and it's not clear, or you're not clear whether you can use dark fiber for leasing to your local carrier, that's what Karen does. So come into us, and she'll work with that agency, and her team will work with that agency to see if we can clear up those barriers or clear up any misunderstandings. So I just want to make that an option for folks who may not have known that that's one of the things that we do at NTIA, or we are working on very closely. But I have a few other questions for our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to the group. So Carol, can you tell us a little bit about the cycle time for some of the universal service programs and when they're opened up?
Sure. Well, both the E-rate and the Rural Healthcare Program, as I said, it's a yearly application process, and for both of those programs, they operate on a funding year that is July 1st to June 30th. So it's not the calendar year, it's not the federal government fiscal year, it's completely different for historical reasons. With the E-rate program, there is what we call a funding window where applications have to be in by a specified date in order to be considered. And we are currently in that funding year window. The funding window typically happens sort of, I don't remember when it opened this year, but it opens like January, February, and it closes like, I don't know, sometime March or April, but it's sort of a specified time period. And because the demand exceeds the amount of money available, you have to file in the funding window in order to be considered. For the Rural Healthcare Program, because it's never hit its funding cap, people can file for funding throughout the year, knowing that they don't run in danger, so to speak, of getting shut out by other applications. And then for both of those programs, the school, the library, or the healthcare provider, they have to get, put it out for bid, get a bid from a service provider, put in an application to get the funding from the USF, and then they get what's called a funding commitment. And then the funding is dispersed, and the funding is dispersed for that funding year. The Connect America Fund, aka the old high-cost program, is completely different. It historically has been a stream of funding that basically you don't apply for it. As I said, historically the vast majority of recipients were incumbent telephone companies. There have been all sorts of complicated rules as to how the funding is calculated. Under the current program for the larger carriers, it's a set amount of money, same amount of money every month. They don't apply for it. I mean, they had that one-time opportunity to accept the funding stream for 6 years, and they accepted or they declined, and then it's the same amount of money for that 6-year period. When we go ahead and implement that competitive bidding process for the additional funding, it will be a one-time bidding activity, where people will say, I'm willing to serve this area for this amount of support or that amount of support. Once we pick who the winning bidder is, and that entity successfully undergoes the post-selection review process, then that entity will get the set amount of funding over a 10-year term. So they won't have to apply again. In other words, it will be set out for a 10-year period. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. So Keith, can you tell us a little bit about some of the investments that you have in Washington State?
Well, yeah, before I do that, I made this mistake when we were in Mountain View. I went through, I think, a little bit too quickly, and I ceded all of my time, so I feel like Ben Carson up here, I mean, I tried to give time, and then now I'm at the end, I wanted to talk about the $6.8 billion that we've invested in rural America since 2009. I wanted to talk about the $143 million we've invested in the state of Washington since 2009. But I seem to have run out of time. But I did.
You're good. Keep talking.
Okay. Well, our infrastructure program in state of Washington, we did almost $74 million. Distance learning and telemedicine, almost $6 million. A little bit more than $1 million, $1.3 million in Community Connect. And our Broadband Initiative Project program, BIP, we did over $62 million. So those were our investments in Washington from 2009 to current.
And do you have a sense of what a successful grant looks like? Do you have any good tips? We can talk about this a little bit more at office hours tomorrow. Put in a little plug there, but just a general overview. Of
everything that you need to know about our 2 grant programs are in our notice of solicitation of application, our NOSA, or our notice of funds availability. It gives you all of the scoring of points and that sort of thing. And really, we have changed our NOSA for the distance learning and telemedicine and for upcoming Community Connect to include 2 special programs we have in USDA, Strike Force and Promise Zones, along with giving special emphasis points for tribal trust area. We have done very well in tribal areas with our grant programs the last few years. This year, for our Community Connect program, we had 68 applications for $130 million, and we were only able to give 5 awards for a little more than $11, but 4 of those awards were in tribal areas. Same with our distance learning and telemedicine. Last year, we received over 200 applications, and we were able to award about 69. So I think when it comes to applying for grants, you just really need to make sure that you're looking at what we're asking for in the notice, and make sure you're talking about the need of the particular area. That's what it really comes down to. And unfortunately, as I mentioned with the numbers, we just don't have enough resources to go around, and we often get calls about worthy programs, but when you are ranking them by a point basis, you really have to look at the needs, and we look at persistent poverty areas, we look at national school lunch program areas. It's all laid out in the notice.
Great, thank you. And Lora, I have a question for you. You touched on this, and Karen touched on this a little bit. One of the things that we have noticed in working with some federal agencies is that the sort of home office or the DC office may come up with a policy, and it doesn't always get out to the field. How do you work with your field offices to make sure, let's say, if the rule changes that you discussed go through, that they know about those and that they're aware so that they can go implement those in communities?
Good question. Actually, this morning, I met with the Seattle field office to let them know about this initiative. We have within our department a broadband working council, so each office, and I'm in the Office of Community Planning and Development, is responsible for reaching out to their counterparts in the field office, and we have 43 across the country. So in community planning and development, our best way of communicating with the field offices is that the person that heads those offices, they meet with their field office directors every other week. And if there's something that is a new policy, or in this case, policy, we already have these things that are eligible, but to remind them or saying that, you know, a specific clarity is providing, we meet with them and in a conference call and saying this is coming up, we have these upcoming rules that we want you to be aware, so when it gets out, you will be familiar. So I did want to make sure that everybody knows, as part of the rulemaking process, once it gets out there, and we will let everybody know, is that you have a 60-day, it would probably be a 60-day public comment period. So the field officers will know this when it will hit the road, and we let the stakeholders know. So the field officers know what your concerns are. We will know what your concerns are. But again, our best way of getting out the word is through the every other week conference calls, and we also have listserv information that goes out to the field offices on a regular basis on new policy.
Great. I can ask the same question of Keith, actually. Since you the same, how do you get new information about your programs out to your field offices?
Well, we have a broadband coordinator in each of our rural development state offices. So we have regular communication with them. We also have a network of posting notices online. So we have a good working relationship with all of our state offices. And probably what sets us apart from most is that we have a group of 25 general field representatives. I talked about Joe and Steve, but we have one in each part, and sometimes they have 2 states. But they're responsible for making sure that they're keeping state directors like Mario in the loop about our programs, and we're really hands-on in that respect because they live in the community, they work with the providers, and they know what's happening on the ground.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for coming back to me.
Of course. All right, so I think you've heard enough from me, and I want to turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. So if you have some general questions or questions about any of these particular programs, please, let's ask them now.
Hi, I'm Randall Harris. I'm with the Quinault Indian Nation. The question I have is, if I'm going to go after a Community Connects grant, okay, and you look at the footprint of the Quinault Indian Nation, and you use the broadband map, and it says that there is a provider there. But that provider doesn't provide that 3 meg connection. In general, that connection is probably 2.4. And so how do I get past that hurdle when we want to apply for that grant?
Well, that's a good question. If you know for a fact that it's 2.4, then we would consider that unserved. So you would submit your application, we would go through the process and rank it, and if you had enough points, then we would make the award contingent on one of our general field representatives going out and doing a test. And if they went out and in fact it was 2.4 and not 3.0, then you wouldn't have anything to worry about. So I would just say do your homework, and if you've done your homework like you sound like you have, then submit your application. Because this program, you can draw your own service area. We're not telling you what service area to draw. You draw it yourself, and then when we go through all the ranking factors and all the points, if you're selected, then the last thing that we do before we initiate the grant agreement is to have somebody go out there and check the speeds.
I'm over here.
Perfect.
Hi, this is sort of addressed to all of you. For the
Can you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, Stephen Bratt, Vancouver Public Schools, Public School District down near Portland, Oregon. For your programs that are trying to service families in poverty at all levels, the big barriers that we're running into is, once you get down to the last people in this population, not only are they poor, but they move a lot. They don't always speak English. There's lots and lots of other barriers to getting them to even apply for and then maintain eligibility for a federal program, or, there's lots of paperwork. There's, all these different things. So what are your agencies doing to kind of make the process, you know, so easy. Like once you get eligible, you get this tag or this sticker or this tag that you can take with you anywhere, and you're going to be able to get the services you need, kind of thing, as opposed to it being a hurdle every place you go, every new apartment you move into, sort of thing.
Someone want to take that one? Lora.
Okay, well, with HUD, that's what we do. So with the grants that we award, they go to the city or the county or the state, and they are the ones that decide how the funds will get to the actual individuals. They usually work with nonprofit organizations that serve the populations, or the public housing authority that automatically serves this population, and or other HUD-assisted families. So they may go from place to place, but usually their housing choice voucher puts them in particular projects or wherever they're wanting to go. So once you're into like the housing choice voucher program, you're already deemed as being eligible, and they work with the housing authority to get their services or whatever else they need. In the event of doing something like a broadband, it's easier as opposed to doing something with individuals. It would be like an area-wide benefit. So if whatever the service area is defined, as long as 51% or more of the people that reside there are low to moderate income, it serves the entire area. Even if you are above the low to moderate income, you still can benefit, but just as long as 70% of, in general, that get the services are low to moderate income, that's all that matters. So that has already been determined. You don't have to go in and do income verification and things like that on an area-wide. But if it's a clientele, it's a little bit more involved. But generally, it is the nonprofit that is the entity that is responsible for ensuring that they meet the income requirements, that if they're moving from place to place, that they would be able to get whatever services that they're getting now, including broadband. But it's not the department that really works with it. It's either the grantee, which is the city or the county, or the state, and the subrecipient.
And for our programs, it would be our partners. We talked about public-private partnerships earlier on today, and that's really what we do. We don't put any fiber in the ground. We don't put any towers up. We don't do any switches. What we do is we invest in projects. People come to us with ideas for loans or grants. So in this particular instance, what you're talking about will be covered under our civil rights. We would send our general field representatives out and make sure that whoever was getting a loan from us or a grant from us was complying with the limited English language proficiency. So we would make sure. We just had an all-hands meeting at the beginning of March where we had our civil rights office come out and talk to us about what we're supposed to do and what our role is to make sure that all of the USDA programs that we administer are open and transparent for everyone.
I would add a slightly different twist to the answer, which is as we work on technical assistance with communities and we work on digital inclusion strategies, I think sometimes the answer is going back to the city that has the closest connection to its constituents and making sure that each division of that city government that touches low-income populations or the limited English proficient populations are including a component of digital literacy into all of their programs. So it's not like just one department's responsibility, but rather is the group that's working on signing folks up for healthcare, are they integrating digital literacy into that outreach? Are the libraries aware of what other benefits exist throughout the local government? So I think that it's a bit of a both and. It's whatever's happening at the federal level to make those policies consistent, but then it's also how are you working to make sure that the digital inclusion concept is integrated throughout the city government.
And if you have a city that is interested in some technical assistance on digital inclusion, as Karen just mentioned, our colleague Aimee is here today. Oh, she's in the back. And she is working with cities and communities on that issue specifically for technical assistance. So please feel free to drop by and talk to her. And she's also available for technical assistance office hours tomorrow morning. So we'll look for you there. Carol, did you have anything to add before?
Well, all I can say is the FCC is going to be considering rule changes for the Lifeline program at the end of the month, and one of the areas of focus is how to improve the process of qualifying consumers for the Lifeline program.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Any other questions?
I'd like to make one plug then.
Sure.
For one of the things that we didn't talk about. NTIA and the National Science Foundation are also, as part of one of the action items from the report, we're putting together a national broadband research agenda. So you should be looking out for that notice that's going to be coming out pretty soon for a convening of academics and researchers and practitioners to try to look at where the remaining questions exist as far as broadband adoption, deployment, competition go. And we're particularly interested in whether there are new policy recommendations that could come out of that process, or where we need to push for greater understanding of the problems. So some of the questions that you might have that you feel weren't answered, consider whether you'd like to contribute to that process, because I think that would be a really important voice to hear in that process.
And I would just say, I would encourage anyone who had any more detailed questions to come to office hours tomorrow to talk to Steve and Joe. But not only that, we have people here from our state office who could talk to you about rural housing and rural business opportunities. So, and broadband is a thread that connects all of that. So don't miss that opportunity either.
So office hours, just so you know, are at the old federal office building at 909 First Avenue. So if you're going to be there tomorrow from like 9 to 10 is when we're doing the office hours with the federal funding folks. So Lora and Carol have graciously agreed to join us, as well as the USDA staff, and so we thank them for that. We'll also have our technical assistant staff, Aimee and Don Williams, available for those hours as well. So we have just a short amount of time, or a little bit amount of time left. I didn't see any additional questions, so let me just see if the panelists have any final things that they want the audience to know, and this time Keith gets to go last, so we'll start with Mira.
So I guess I would echo something that David Edelman said this morning about the process that the Broadband Opportunity Council went through at the federal level being a potentially useful process at the state level and the local level to go through, just to make sure that the folks who are working on the water sewer programs are thinking about broadband, just to make sure that the folks who are working on the community development components are also aware of these new opportunities that exist. So trying to find where the barriers are, at whether it's at the local level, the county level, the state level, or obviously if it's at the federal level, it's really within our purview. But take a look at across the board how you can integrate the thinking about broadband adoption and deployment throughout the various parts of your governments.
Well, with respect to the Universal Service Fund, as I said, we've been adjusting and fine-tuning various aspects of the Universal Service programs literally for the last 5 years under this administration. That work is ongoing. Unlike some of my colleagues here in the federal government, we do not have field offices in the states, but please, I encourage you to reach out to me and my colleagues at the FCC directly, because we don't have a presence in the state to educate us about particular challenges and barriers. So, you know, that's how we learn what's really going out there in the field. So please feel free to do that.
I would encourage, like I said earlier, if you're not already acquainted with your local community development community planning and development office, or the field office in general, to outreach to them and talk to them, get familiar, see what their funding process is, and seeing what funds are available and how they're going to expend their funds, getting involved with the consolidated plan process. Also, to keep aware about some of the things that we're doing. I urge you to visit our HUD.gov website. We have our announcements, our news releases available. We also have a HUD Exchange website that is every program in the department is on there, and that's the best way to get on their mailing list. So when new policies go out, new regs, anything that may be of interest, you would be instantly notified. And that's the best way that we can communicate, because we have thousands of grantees. And like I said, the field offices, they're busy a lot of times, but that's the best way of getting the information. We do have a field office here in Seattle as well as in Portland, Oregon, and we try and communicate with them as often as possible, but that's the best way to get our funds, is to get involved with our local grantees.
And I would just say, take a look at the Broadband Opportunity Council report, and specifically the USDA actions. We have 4 really good actions in there that you may be able to take advantage of. One is our Community Facilities Program, which has some authorities that we don't have in our U.S., which may be able to fund municipal broadband. We also have our Rural Business Cooperative Service, which has business and industry loans that can be used for consulting or some other needs that you may have that are non-construction. We also have our Electric Smart Grid program, where funds could be made available for electric co-ops, electric subsidiaries. They may not be able to take it all the way to the home, but they may be able to get 60% of the way there. And we're also looking in the telecom program at rewriting our regulation, which is out of date, to give our administrator more flexibility and into providing broadband in rural areas.
Thank you. So with this, I just want to note that most of the questions that we get with technical assistance is, where's the money? And I think you have a sense now of really one of the 3 biggest funders in the government as to where broadband funding can come from, and some ideas for what you might be able to take back to your community. And so with that, I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us here today. And thank you all.